The great drawing-room of Witchford Hall had been arranged with the sort of self-conscious elegance that suggested an event meant to be both intimate and grand. A cocktail gathering where the glasses were thin, the smiles thinner, and the silences of the well-bred carried the weight of entire conversations. It was Lady Honoria Venn's doing, of course. Everything she touched acquired that faintly brittle sheen, like crystal on the edge of cracking. Inspector Alleyn, invited under the benign pretext of a weekend among old acquaintances, moved quietly through the room with the long, understated stride of a man accustomed to observing without being observed. Though he was no stranger to the more ostentatious reaches of high society, he sensed something restrained yet faintly jarring beneath the polite chatter, like a violin slightly off tune in an otherwise perfect string quartet. At the center of the room stood Adrian Lascelles, the newly minted heir to the Lascelles fortune, a neat, round £5 million that had arrived in his hands not a week earlier with the sudden death of his uncle, Sir Peregrine Lascelles. Adrian was speaking animatedly to a cluster of admiring debutantes and their mothers, though Alleyn could see the strain creeping in at the young man's temples. His laughter, though frequent, came a fraction too late. His glass, though perpetually full, was lifted more often to his lips than tasted. "He's not accustomed to being watched," murmured a voice at Alleyn's elbow. It belonged to Madeline Carswell, a slender figure in moss-green silk. She possessed the kind of beauty that did not demand a room's attention, but quietly compelled it. Her eyes followed Adrian with a kind of wary tenderness. "They're all watching him," she continued softly. "Every gesture, every smile. They're measuring him like merchants appraising a shipment." "Of what?" Alleyn asked. "Of money, Inspector. £5 million turns a rather decent young man into a specimen." Alleyn said nothing. He merely inclined his head, letting his gaze sweep the room. If Madeline was correct, and she often was, he recalled, then Witchford Hall had become a stage, the players finely dressed, the roles assigned, and the fortune the unspoken script from which they all read. Lady Honoria herself glided past them, offering a sharp smile of greeting. Her eyes, cool and pale as watered glass, flickered to Adrian and then back to Alleyn with the faintest trace of satisfaction. She had been Sir Peregrine's younger sister and had expected, perhaps even deserved, a larger share of the estate. But Sir Peregrine had been eccentric in his final days, and a touch vindictive. The fortune had gone entirely to Adrian, his nephew. Honoria's bitterness had not gone unnoticed. Near the piano, Mr. Geoffrey Patham, Sir Peregrine's solicitor, stood in rigid posture, his hand resting on the polished lid. His gaze weighed Adrian with a legalist's precision, a man keenly aware of signatures, clauses, and contingencies. Beside him was Dr. Lionel Graves, the late Sir Peregrine's physician, who sipped his white wine as though contemplating the ethics of every mouthful. His brows were drawn faintly, as if he still found Sir Peregrine's sudden death a puzzle he could not quite resolve. A burst of laughter came from the corner where Evo Bradham, a playwright of some repute and little tact, was entertaining a small coterie of admirers. He was speaking loudly about the mystique of inheritance, and more loudly still about Adrian's utterly cinematic rise. His voice carried with the force of someone who enjoyed the sound of his own pronouncements far more than the substance. Alleyn watched Adrian's reaction as the remarks drifted toward him, a subtle stiffening, the dimming of amusement in his eyes. A flicker, barely perceptible but enough, of something like apprehension. It was not, Alleyn thought, the apprehension of guilt. Rather, the unease of a man who had not sought wealth but had been handed it like a blade, sharp, gleaming, and dangerous to touch. A footman glided through with another tray of drinks. Alleyn noted the man's hesitance, a fraction of a moment in which he avoided Adrian's gaze. Curious. The staff of such estates were usually paragons of discretion, Yet this one carried a tension about him, as though a word or glance might betray more than he wished to show. Madeline's voice broke softly into Alleyn's thoughts. "You sense it, don't you?" He did. Not a loud discord, but a soft, persistent vibration beneath the surface. A collective holding of breath. The air in Witchford Hall felt faintly charged, like a storm contemplating its descent. And Adrian Lascelles, the air, the figure at the center of this elegant web, smiled too brightly, drank too quickly, and spoke as if trying desperately to drown out the knowledge that £5 million does not come without its shadows. The evening shimmered on, polite, graceful, and very, very fragile. The next morning, Witchford Hall awoke to a silence heavier than the usual calm of a country estate. The air, tempered by a mist that pressed against the windows and pooled in the corners of the gardens, carried with it an uncanny stillness, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Alleyn, having decided to remain for the weekend at Lady Honoria's invitation, found himself drawn to the library before breakfast, a room of dark oak panels, faintly perfumed by old leather and wax polish. It was there that the first quiet alarm of the day arrived. A housemaid, thin and pale with nerves, appeared at the door. Her hands trembled as she pressed a folded note into Alleyn's palm. "Sir, there's been something, sir," she stammered. Alleyn gave her a calm look, measured but firm. "Show me." She led him down a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of dust and boiled coffee, to a small, seldom-used guest chamber at the east wing. The door was slightly ajar, revealing the faint morning light falling across the carpet. Alleyn noted with a practiced eye the irregularity of the shadows, the misalignment of a chair, the slight tilt of a vase. Small hints that something had disturbed the ordinary order. And then he saw him. Adrian Lascelles lay slumped across the edge of the writing desk, his head turned toward the window as if he had merely nodded off while observing the morning sun. His hand clutched a pen, still wet with ink. There was no scream, no chaos, no dramatic tableau, only a quiet finality. The stillness of the room pressed down upon Alleyn as heavily as the walls themselves. Alleyn noted first the absence of struggle. There were no overturned chairs, no broken glass. A single sheet of paper lay partially beneath Adrian's body, the writing smudged but legible in cursive loops. It appeared to be a letter, unfinished, the words trailing off like thoughts abruptly interrupted. The inspector's gaze shifted to the small details, the angle of the body, the slight pallor of the skin, the faint odor that suggested something medicinal, perhaps tranquilizing rather than violent. A bottle of prescription tablets lay innocuously on the desk, its label catching the light. For sleep disturbances. It was a death of quiet precision, almost deliberate in its restraint. Alleyn felt a flicker of unease. Not because of the wealth, nor the potential scandal, but because of the careful, almost aesthetic quality of the scene. A man with £5 million at the beginning of his adulthood had died in a room of order and civility. There was a cruel irony to it, yet no theatrics, no declaration. Just silence. The house began to stir in the corridor. Lady Honoria arrived first, her face a mask of composure threaded with subtle tension. She placed a gloved hand lightly on Alleyn's arm. "Roderick, what has happened?" Alleyn shook his head, gently, almost apologetically. "I do not yet know, Honoria. But it is imperative we disturb nothing and question all." Madeline Carswell appeared moments later, her green silk dress muted by the morning light, her eyes wide but not faintly with hysteria. Rather, with a careful control. She lingered near the door frame, studying the room, the body, the minutiae of disruption, as though the clues might reveal themselves in the spaces between. The butler, Mr. Reynolds, arrived in silence, a shadow among shadows. His face was impassive, but Alleyn caught the subtle tension in his posture. Not shock, not grief, but the faintest trace of foreknowledge, or perhaps simply long experience with death in domestic quarters. Alleyn took stock. Every person present, from Lady Honoria to the servants, maintained a rigid decorum. Their voices were low, their gestures measured. Even the morning sunlight seemed muted, as if it too feared to intrude. Yet beneath that decorum, Alleyn could sense the first tremors of the inevitable unraveling. He did not speak further, he merely observed. The crease in Lady Honoria's forehead, the way Madeline's fingers lightly traced the doorframe, the tilt of Reynolds's head as he surveyed the desk. A death so contained, so silent, had a way of speaking in whispers, in glances, in hesitations, in what people did not say. Alleyn would listen. He always did. And already, in the quietest corners of Witchford Hall, the first fissures of tension were beginning to appear, faint, almost invisible, yet unmistakable to one who knew how to watch. Alleyn remained in the East Wing long after the arrival of the first responders, or, more accurately, those who were not yet official, but acted as such in the familiar dance of upper-class English households. The local constabulary had not yet been summoned. The household, in its initial shock, sought to contain the event within its own walls. The inspector understood this perfectly. A death of any magnitude, particularly one involving fortune and family, often revealed less in evidence than in the tremors of social interaction. He stood quietly in the doorway of Adrian Lascelles' room, eyes sweeping with deliberate care. The angle of the morning light highlighted the subtle disarray. A chair drawn slightly too close to the desk, the ink-stained sheet curling at the edges, a glass of water tipped just enough to cast a faint reflection. Each minor irregularity, when viewed together, suggested a struggle against circumstance rather than against a person. Alleyn's lips pressed into a thoughtful line. Lady Honoria lingered nearby, seated in a wing-back chair with impeccable posture, her hands clasped in her lap. She spoke little, her voice a soft murmur, carefully controlled, yet her eyes betrayed the faintest flicker of something Alleyn had learned to recognize as anticipation, the delicate, almost imperceptible weighing of advantage. She did not rush, did not call for answers. She watched quietly, as though the very act of observation might serve her in ways conversation could not. From the doorway, Alleyn's gaze swept to the corridor beyond, where the household staff moved with cautious precision. Reynolds, the butler, passed with trays and linens, his footsteps muffled but meticulous. Even the housemaids, who normally bustled with anxious energy, seemed tempered, almost wary of the inspector's calm scrutiny. Alleyn noted the alignment of their hands, the rhythm of their movement, the small unconscious behaviors that betrayed nervousness or knowledge. Madeline Carswell, meanwhile, hovered at the edge of the room, her presence quiet but pointed. She spoke with a soft, deliberate enunciation of someone accustomed to careful observation. Yet it was not her speech that drew Alleyn's attention, but the subtle way she tilted her head, the way her fingers rested against the doorframe. Small movements, seemingly trivial, yet each carrying meaning for one who knew how to read a room as one reads a finely bound book. Alleyn's mind, always methodical, catalogued these impressions silently. He did not question immediately. The time for speech would come later. The present was observation, the study of relationships in their unspoken form. His attention returned to the body. Adrian's face, calm despite its pallor, suggested a sleep interrupted rather than a life violently ended. The pen still clutched in his hand, the half-finished letter, the undisturbed drawers of the desk. These were all cues. Alleyn noted that certain objects were slightly out of place, just enough to hint at human interaction without alarm. The quiet precision of the scene was a statement in itself, and Alleyn appreciated that the perpetrator, if there was one, had understood the art of subtlety. Alleyn allowed his gaze to wander to the library beyond, and the adjoining rooms that opened like a sequence of scenes. A painting tilted on its hook, a rug slightly askew. Nothing that screamed chaos, nothing dramatic, yet in their cumulative effect they whispered of tension and imbalance. Alleyn's eyes lingered where the shadows fell longest, noting the small, human errors that suggested an intruder or a visitor whose presence had disrupted normality, if only for a moment. At last, Alleyn spoke, his voice calm, precise. "We shall need to speak to everyone present yesterday evening. No exceptions." Lady Honoria inclined her head ever so slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement and feigned composure. "Of course, Roderick, but I trust discretion will be maintained." "Always," he replied, with a faint, courteous smile. "And Honoria, I should caution that the truth often resides not in what is said, but in the pauses between words." A flicker of recognition passed over her face, almost imperceptible, and Alleyn made a mental note. Honoria's restraint might conceal impatience or ambition or merely self-control. But it also told him she was alert, aware that eyes watched more than ears listened. Alleyn stepped back to the corridor, leaving the room in the quiet custody of the household. He moved slowly, not with urgency, but with the deliberation of a man cataloguing human behavior. The alignment of gestures, the avoidance of glances, the faint tensions beneath otherwise perfect politeness. He sensed already that the coming interviews would yield far more than the apparent disorder of the room, that each subtle inflection, each carefully measured hesitation, would speak volumes. And above it all, the stillness of the morning pressed on, a silence so quiet that even the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed almost too loud, as though Witchford Hall itself awaited the first words that would begin to unravel its delicate equilibrium. By mid-morning, the household had settled into a fragile rhythm. Alleyn, moving with unobtrusive efficiency, began his discreet inquiries. He did not call it an interrogation. He preferred the subtler art of conversation, where questions were framed as gentle curiosity and answers often revealed themselves in what was left unsaid. His first call was upon Lady Honoria. She received him in her morning drawing-room, a sunlit chamber of pale silk draperies and the faint scent of bergamot. Her posture was immaculate, as though shock were a creature she intended to tame rather than exhibit. "I'm dreadfully sorry about Adrian," she said, her tone measured, almost rehearsed, though of course there was nothing any of us could have foreseen. Alleyn inclined his head. "Indeed, but we must understand the circumstances, Honoria. Perhaps you can tell me of last evening, the company, the conversations, anything that might illuminate tensions." Honoria's eyes flicked toward the windows, then back to him. "Tensions?" she repeated softly, as though testing the word on her tongue. "One always hopes there are none, Inspector. And yet, families are never so simple, are they?" A faint, almost imperceptible pause followed. Alleyn noted the way her hands, which rested upon the arms of her chair, twitched for the briefest instant. Nothing overt, but enough to suggest the mind calculating, weighing words, balancing concealment with honesty. Next, he spoke with Madeline Carswell, who had taken refuge in the library with a cup of tea, her hands wrapped around the porcelain like a fragile talisman. She did not protest his presence, nor did she speak too quickly. "Madeline," Alleyn began, "you were with Adrian during the evening gathering, I believe?" "Yes," she said, a soft note of emphasis in the single word. We spoke, briefly, but it was not a private conversation. There were others present and—" She hesitated, glancing toward the hallway. "And sometimes one must choose what to say." Alleyn made no comment, only observed. Her restraint was telling. She revealed precisely enough to confirm proximity, but withheld insight, either to protect herself or another. He moved through the staff with equal subtlety. Reynolds, the butler, was impeccably composed, yet his careful attention to phrasing betrayed awareness. He described the household routines, the meals, the arrangement of guests, all with precise language, yet Alleyn detected slight hedges in phrasing, infinitesimal shifts in posture when Adrian's name arose. "You observed everything last evening, Mr. Reynolds?" Alleyn inquired. "Everything, sir," Reynolds said, voice steady, but the briefest tightening of his jaw betrayed a measured caution. "Though some moments are not for the eyes of gentlemen or ladies to witness. One sees, yes, but does not speak." Alleyn's attention flicked to the faint creases beneath Reynolds's eyes, the posture slightly more rigid than required. The butler's discretion was not mere protocol. It hinted at knowledge, careful, precise, and chosen. Alleyn's interviews with other guests proceeded in the same fashion. Each offered civility, each maintained a facade of composure. Mr. Geoffrey Patham, the solicitor, spoke in clipped, careful sentences, emphasizing legal proprieties rather than human emotion. Dr. Lionel Graves, the physician, answered with detached rationality, yet his eyes lingered too long on Adrian's room when he thought Alleyn was not observing. Even Ivo Bradham, flamboyant and genial in social gatherings, now exhibited a rare restraint, a hint that the gravity of the morning had dampened his habitual performance. Across these exchanges, Alleyn observed the same subtle truths emerging, the interplay of ambition, restraint, and private knowledge. He asked no direct question of motive, no overt suggestion of guilt, but noted the cadence of speech, the pauses, the carefully constructed politeness. In the drawing rooms and corridors of Witchford Hall, social etiquette served as both mask and revelation. By the time Alleyn concluded this round of interviews, he had learned far more than any casual inquiry might have yielded. Patterns emerged in the way hands fidgeted, eyes avoided, and silences lengthened. Tension was not loud. It was present in every measured glance and courteous exchange. Alleyn lingered in the hall outside the library, observing the household in their restrained movements. He sensed the underlying currents, loyalty, fear, resentment, curiosity, all woven into the polished fabric of social grace. And in that silence, he understood what he often understood before any evidence was collected. The key to this mystery would lie not in the grand gestures, but in the careful, deliberate omissions of those present, in the subtle fissures of civility, and in the quiet, measured responses to questions never fully asked. Alleyn allowed himself a small, inward smile. The hunt, as ever, would begin with observation. And in Witchford Hall, observation promised to be a study in elegance and in restraint. Alleyn spent the early afternoon moving among the less conspicuous spaces of Witchford Hall. Corridors that smelled faintly of polish and old wood, stairways lined with family portraits, and quiet offices where the household accounts were maintained. In these liminal zones, the staff held sway, a discreet kingdom of knowledge that neither Lady Honoria nor the guests could penetrate. It was here, Alleyn knew, that the most telling truths often lingered, unspoken. He found Reynolds in the service corridor, polishing the brass fittings of the sideboard with meticulous care. The butler's movements were precise, almost ritualistic, and Alleyn noted the subtle tension in his shoulders. "Mr. Reynolds," Alleyn began, his voice low, "I wonder if you might spare a few minutes to discuss last evening. The household, the guests, anything you observed." Reynolds' hands paused mid-polish. He inclined his head politely. "Sir, you're welcome to ask, but—" His voice trailed off, just enough to suggest an unspoken boundary. Some things are not for the ears of even the most curious visitor. Alleyn said nothing, merely observing. A faint quiver in Reynolds's lips, the subtle avoidance of eye contact, the slight tightening of his fingers around the cloth. All were signs, if one knew how to read them. "I'm not here to accuse," Alleyn continued softly. "Only to understand. Sometimes the smallest detail, a glance, a hesitation, the way a tray is carried, can illuminate what might otherwise remain hidden. Reynolds' eyes flickered toward the floorboards, then back to Alleyn. "Sir, the household, we notice things. We see little departures from routine. A guest who lingers longer at a window, a hand that trembles when a glass is poured. But we do not speak unless compelled. It is our way." Alleyn inclined his head. He had seen this countless times, servants who were both guardians and witnesses, whose knowledge was intimate yet disciplined. "And you did notice such departures?" The butler's lips pressed together. "Yes, sir. There were small irregularities. But in a house such as Witchford, the line between oddity and concern is subtle, and it is not our place to draw attention. We serve and we observe." Alleyn allowed a brief pause, then asked quietly, "Might I ask, in your opinion, did any guest behave in a manner markedly unusual?" Reynolds hesitated, then spoke with the measured deliberation of someone selecting words as though choosing stones to lay a path. "Sir, there is always something unusual, but in this instance, it is not for me to judge what matters and what does not. One merely notices. That is all." Alleyn nodded, noting the restraint. Reynolds's discretion was total, yet in his careful refusal, he had revealed more than casual speech ever could. A repository of observations held in silence, shaping the undercurrents of the house. Later, Alleyn spoke with Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, whose domain was the domestic rhythm of the kitchens and the maintenance of order. She was small, austere, and spoke with a clipped precision that suggested habit and endurance. "Yes, Inspector," she said when he broached the subject of the previous evening. "We saw and we heard, but a house is full of noises and movements. A chair scraped, a footstep hurried, a whisper of laughter. The young master, he is beloved, yes, but £5 million can make one notice even the smallest shifts." Alleyn observed her hands, folded over each other, the knuckles slightly pale. "And did you notice anything? Anyone behaving differently than usual?" Mrs. Hargreaves gave a faint, imperceptible nod, then shook her head. "One must choose one's battles, sir. Some things are for the eyes, some for the mind, and some are for neither." Alleyn smiled faintly. That, he knew, was the language of the silent witness, an acknowledgement that the servants knew more than they spoke, that the patterns of behavior were recorded meticulously in memory, and that these patterns could, if he were patient, reveal the subtler dynamics among the household and guests. By mid-afternoon, Alleyn had completed his quiet circuit of observation. The servant's silence was not defiance, it was careful stewardship. Yet through it, he had already gleaned hints of alliances, fears, and unspoken judgments. Alleyn leaned against the corridor wall, allowing the weight of the choir to settle around him. The house, the guests, and the staff were all interwoven in a complex tapestry of civility, observation, and discretion. And within that tapestry, he sensed the first outlines of motive, subtle and restrained, waiting to be teased into light by patience, courtesy, and the delicate art of quiet questioning. The day remained unbroken. The hallways, corridors, and drawing rooms retained their calm exterior. Yet beneath that calm, Alleyn could feel the faint tremor of inevitability, as though Witchford Hall itself waited for the truth to step quietly into its proper place. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Witchford Hall, falling in golden shafts that lit dust motes like flecks of suspended gold. Alleyn wandered slowly through the east wing once more, his attention drawn less to what had been disrupted than to what had not. In a house so accustomed to precision, routine could reveal as much as any deviation, and the smallest irregularity, when observed in context, often proved more telling than overt evidence. He paused at the breakfast room, noting the china arranged with immaculate care. A tray of untouched toast lay by the sideboard, buttered but cooling, as though someone had set it aside in haste. Alleyn's gaze swept the table. Nothing seemed out of place, yet there was something subtly amiss. A pattern, familiar, comforting, had been broken. He followed the trail of minor irregularities into the drawing room. Lady Honoria was engaged in polite conversation with a distant cousin, her composure intact, yet Alleyn caught the tiny habitual gestures she performed absent-mindedly, the slight tapping of her ring against her teacup, the delicate adjustment of a cushion beneath her elbow. These were movements repeated countless times a day, unconsciously executed, and Alleyn had long learned that deviation in such routines often indicated emotional perturbation. Then his eyes fell upon the small marble mantelpiece where Adrian had often left his morning letters and notes. Today, a single envelope lay slightly askew, the flap unsealed. Alleyn's trained eye detected something instantly. It was not the letter itself, but the habitual placement that mattered. Adrian had a meticulous habit of stacking correspondence in neat, descending order by importance. This envelope had been left atop the stack, a silent anomaly. Alleyn lifted it carefully. The handwriting was familiar, precise and deliberate. The content, though brief, offered no overt clue, merely a few sentences regarding an estate matter. Yet it was the timing, the placement, and the choice to leave it where it would be noticed that suggested intention. Someone had chosen to disrupt Adrian's routine. Not violently, not dramatically, but enough to leave a subtle message, or a signal of intrusion. The inspector's gaze wandered toward the family schedule that hung beside the fireplace, the daily movements of guests, servants, and the heir himself, laid out in minute detail by Reynolds. He noted the slight irregularities. A breakfast time shifted by 10 minutes, a room entered that was usually avoided, a servant's footsteps louder than usual in the corridor above. Alleyn catalogued them all, not as evidence of guilt, but as hints of disturbance. Someone had been present, unnoticed by others, moving through Witchford Hall with quiet purpose. A sudden sound drew his attention, a faint, deliberate cough from the corner of the room. Alleyn turned to see Madeline Carswell, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, her eyes fixed on a volume of poetry resting upon the side table. She had been observing him as much as he had been observing her. "You notice the little things," she said softly, almost as a statement rather than a question. "Indeed," Alleyn replied. "The mundane often speaks volumes if one knows how to listen." Her gaze lingered on the mantelpiece, on the envelope, then returned to him. And sometimes it is what is left in place, or left out, that reveals more than words ever could. Alleyn inclined his head, acknowledging the subtlety. She understood the interplay of routine and irregularity. She, like the household, was attuned to the rhythm of life at Witchford Hall. And in that attunement lay the first faint outlines of truth. He allowed himself a moment to survey the room once more, letting the quiet accumulate. The chairs, the fireplace, the unlit lamps, even the lingering scent of afternoon tea. All of it comprised a choreography of habit, repeated countless times, now punctuated by a deviation so slight that most would never notice. Yet Alleyn did. These were the threads he would follow, the broken habits, the altered routines, the gestures and placements that seemed innocuous to casual eyes. In them lay the signature of presence and intention, a subtle whisper of the unseen. Alleyn stepped back, letting the room return to its stillness. The quiet revelation settled like dust. In a house so measured, so disciplined, even the smallest disruption could be a statement. And statements, he knew, often spoke louder than confessions. By late afternoon, Witchford Hall had assumed a curious stillness, the sort of quiet that spoke less of calm than of anticipation. Alleyn remained in the drawing room, notebook in hand, observing the gentle ebb of domestic motion, the subtle undercurrents of unease that seemed to ripple beneath the polished veneer of civility. Even the sunlight, now softened by the drifting clouds, appeared to pause, reluctant to disturb the measured elegance of the house. It was then that a faint commotion drew him toward the hallway leading to the north wing. Reynolds, ever the silent sentinel, moved ahead with careful composure, but the slight tremor in his step betrayed a tension that was normally invisible. Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, followed behind, her lips pressed together in an expression that suggested both concern and restraint. In the sitting room, Alleyn found Lady Honoria and Madeline together, both bent over a letter, their expressions a study in muted agitation. The envelope, cream and elegant, had arrived unexpectedly by post. Not in the usual morning dispatch, but now, hours later, quietly placed upon the small marble table. Alleyn took the letter from Honoria's hands with gentle care. The handwriting was precise, the signature absent, yet the contents suggested familiarity. A reference to Adrian's recent inheritance, the hint of observation during the evening gathering, and a subtle warning couched in polite language. Nothing overt, nothing accusatory, merely a reminder that the world was watching and that attention could carry consequences. Alleyn studied the paper, noting the slight smudge in the lower margin as though it had brushed against something unintended. It was a minor imperfection, easily overlooked, but in Witchford Hall, minor imperfections were seldom without significance. "Who could have sent this?" Lady Honoria murmured, her voice quiet yet taut. "That, my lady," Alleyn replied, "is precisely the question we must answer, and it may not be the sender we suspect immediately." He returned the letter to his pocket, deciding to examine it more closely in the privacy of his study. Meanwhile, a subtle ripple passed through the household. Servants exchanged brief glances. Reynolds' hands gripped the edges of the tray he carried a fraction too tightly. Even Madeline, usually composed, allowed the faintest tension to manifest in the arch of her brows. The letter had stirred something beneath the calm, a silent collapse of certainty, the first tremor in the carefully arranged facade of civility. Alleyn moved toward the kitchen to observe the staff in their routines. He noted the small irregularities. The cook paused mid-stir, the footman hesitated while setting the teacups, and a chambermaid lingered at the pantry door, as though considering whether to speak or remain silent. Each minor deviation was a thread, a point of tension connecting observation to intention. Later, Alleyn found himself in Adrian's private study, where the desk and shelves appeared undisturbed since the morning. Yet the envelope, placed upon the mantelpiece, had altered the atmosphere. It was a quiet intrusion, a reminder that even in a house as disciplined as Witchford, one could not assume control over every variable. Alleyn examined the small details again. The slight tilt of the inkwell, the faint indentation of a pen on the blotter, the way the afternoon light caught the edge of a manuscript. Each item, mundane in isolation, now seemed charged with potential meaning. He returned to the drawing room, where Lady Honoria and Madeline had resumed their positions near the window. Alleyn noted the subtle shift in the lady's posture. A shared glance, almost imperceptible, the kind of silent communication that suggested concern, perhaps even fear, though carefully contained. A soft knock at the door drew Alleyn's attention. It was Reynolds. "Sir, there is a matter I thought you should know. It is delicate." Alleyn inclined his head. "Of course. Please, proceed." The butler's eyes flicked toward the room beyond, then back to Alleyn. "It concerns an object, sir. Something Adrian handled yesterday evening. It is missing." The word, delivered in quiet, almost respectful tones, resonated like a chord struck softly in the hall. It was neither loud nor dramatic, yet its implications were unmistakable. Another fissure in the orderly routine, a second stirring that promised to unravel more than a single anomaly. Alleyn's gaze lingered on the faces before him. The tension in Witchford Hall was no longer a quiet tremor. It had begun its subtle, inexorable ascent, threading through glances, gestures, and the careful routines of the household. And in that stillness, he recognized the first outlines of intent, quiet, deliberate, and unsettlingly precise. As evening descended upon Witchford Hall, a quiet introspection settled over Inspector Alleyn. The day's observations, interviews, and the subtle tremors that had arisen from both guests and staff now coalesced in his mind like faint constellations against a darkening sky. He did not rush. He rarely did. Instead, he allowed the impressions to settle, as dust might in the corners of a long-used room, until each subtle particle of evidence could be examined in its proper place. Alleyn wandered the corridors alone, noting the faint odors of late tea and polished wood, the quiet murmur of servants attending to unseen chores. Each step was deliberate, measured, allowing the echoes to inform him of spatial dynamics, human movement, and the faint emotional residue left in the wake of tension. It was a skill born of patience, of observing that which was overlooked. He returned to Adrian's study, now empty, where the morning's anomalies lay untouched, the half-finished letter, the tilted envelope, the delicate disruption of routine. Alleyn crouched, examining the edge of the desk, noting the slight indentation where a hand had rested and the almost imperceptible smudge of ink along the margin of the EOC blotter. It spoke not of violence, but of intention, a precision that had gone unnoticed by casual eyes. In the drawing room, Lady Honoria paced lightly near the window, while Madeline Carswell remained seated, hands folded neatly, eyes fixed on the floor as if considering some internal puzzle. Alleyn observed their manner, noting the contrasts. Honoria's controlled agitation versus Madeline's deliberate stillness, both revealing a subtle landscape of emotion, concern, calculation, restraint. Alleyn allowed himself a faint smile at the quiet artistry of human behavior. Each gesture, each hesitation, each careful avoidance of eye contact was a syllable in the sentence of truth. The household, he realized, was speaking in a language of omission and nuance. And to one trained to read such language, the narrative was already forming. He recalled Reynolds's careful phrasing, the housekeeper's measured nods, the subtle shifts in posture among the servants. The knowledge they held was not casual. It was deliberate, curated, and communicated in whispers of motion rather than words. Alleyn did not need immediate confession. He needed recognition, the awareness that the puzzle existed and that it would yield under patient observation. Alleyn's mind turned to Adrian's recent inheritance, the sudden arrival of £5 million, and the subtle frictions that wealth had introduced into Witchford Hall. The heir's composure, though superficially intact, had been punctuated by small inconsistencies. Laughter that arrived late, a glass lifted more frequently than sipped, eyes flickering at unintended moments. Each was a signpost, pointing not merely to anxiety, but to the complex interplay of ambition, expectation, and desire. The letter of warning, now tucked safely in his coat pocket, added another layer. It was quiet, polite, almost innocent in tone, yet it carried the unmistakable weight of observation. The hand of someone familiar with the household, its routines, and its vulnerabilities. Alleyn noted how the message had shifted the equilibrium, how the servants' composure subtly fractured, how the guests' carefully constructed facades showed fine, almost invisible fissures. He paused near the window and allowed himself a moment of reflection. The clarity of intuition, he knew, was seldom immediate. It required absorption of detail, a patient patience, and the recognition of patterns that emerged only when one's attention was unhurried, unforced. He had watched, he had listened, and now the the first coherent outlines of the motive and the likely course of events began to settle. Alleyn did not yet speak. There was no urgency, no need for dramatic declarations. In his experience, the revelation of truth was never rushed. It revealed itself in due course, often in whispers rather than shouts, in gestures rather than words, and in the delicate collapse of pretense rather than in confrontation. He let the stillness of Wickford Hall envelop him, noting the interplay of light and shadow, sound and silence. Every minor movement, every hesitation, every carefully measured word had left its trace. And Alleyn, with the certainty born of quiet observation and refined intuition, understood that the house itself, the servants, and the guests were now poised at the edge of disclosure, ready, in their own time, to yield the truth. And so, as evening deepened and the first hints of twilight brushed the windows, Alleyn allowed his intuition to settle like dust, knowing that the next moments, quiet, deliberate, and carefully orchestrated, would illuminate the unseen with the inevitability of observation and the subtle artistry of human behavior. Night had fallen over Wickford Hall, and the house settled into an almost ceremonious quiet. The staff moved with muted precision, carrying trays and extinguishing lamps in the corridors, while the family and guests lingered in the drawing room, wrapped in the subdued glow of shaded sconces. It was a quiet stage, elegant and deliberate, the atmosphere poised on the delicate edge between tension and restraint. Alleyn, having taken stock of the day's observations and subtle irregularities, decided it was time for a private consultation. He asked Lady Honoria to excuse him for a brief walk in the library, and she consented with the faintest inclination of her head, her composure impeccable but her eyes quietly alert. The library, a room of warm oak and shadowed corners, afforded both privacy and a sense of intimacy. Alleyn motioned for Madeline Carswell to remain nearby, yet just outside the circle of discussion. She understood the unspoken rule. The detective's work was often invisible until its revelation, and she accepted her role with calm patience. Alleyn's gaze rested upon Lady Honoria. "Honoria," he began, "you have been attentive, discreet, and composed throughout. I have no doubt you have noticed subtleties that others might have missed. I wonder if you might indulge me with a small observation." Lady Honoria inclined her head slightly. "I shall do my best, Roderick. You know I always try." Alleyn allowed a faint pause, choosing his words with precision. "The household, the guests, even Adrian himself, each has left traces of thought, intention, or concern. Some are obvious, others nearly imperceptible. You are aware, are you not, of the letter that arrived this afternoon?" Her lips pressed into a delicate line. "I am," she said softly, and it unsettled the household, though none would admit it aloud. "Precisely," Alleyn continued. "The sender is careful, observant, deliberate. They know the rhythms of Wickford Hall, the habits, the gestures, the silences, and yet the letter carries more than a warning. It carries a message of presence." Honoria's eyes, cool and precise, met his. There was no fear, merely acknowledgement. She understood his meaning. Someone had intruded into the carefully measured order of the house, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Alleyn's gaze softened. "Honoria, I do not speak lightly. The individual responsible for Adrian's death is within our circle. They are accustomed to the discipline of observation, to reading gestures, to moving with quiet purpose, and they assumed the house's rhythms would conceal them." Her hands, resting on the edge of the desk, tightened fractionally. "You believe it is someone we know?" "I do," he said. "And yet they are not reckless. They understand discretion, which is why the truth is revealed more in hesitation than in speech, more in omission than action, and the critical detail lies in what they cannot control, The involuntary gestures, the slight misalignments, the tiny fractures beneath a polished exterior. Lady Honoria exhaled softly, a quiet acknowledgement of inevitability. She did not resist. She merely absorbed, measured, and waited. Alleyn's method was not the dramatic confrontation of popular imagination. It was far subtler, a quiet illumination, an unveiling in the manner of observation rather than accusation. He stood, moving closer. "I shall not yet disclose the name. That will come when the time is right. But the individual will reveal themselves, either through the weight of guilt, the pressure of social expectation, or the unavoidable lapse of a habit once carefully maintained." Honoria inclined her head. "And the household, the guests?" "They will remain undisturbed for now," Alleyn replied. "Their part is to act as they always have, with civility and restraint. Yet in these next hours, the smallest movements, the subtlest glances, the quietest gestures, all will speak the truth." Alleyn paused, allowing the weight of silence to settle over them. There was no shouting, no dramatic disclosure, only the gentle hum of expectation poised like a taut string. "Roderick," Lady Honoria said softly, "you see everything, even the things we try to hide from ourselves." He offered a faint smile, the trace of warmth beneath his cultivated composure. "Not everything, Honoria, but enough. And in that enough, the truth has a way of revealing itself, quietly, inevitably." As he left the library, Alleyn sensed the subtle shift in the air. The household, the guests, the quiet corridors of Witchford Hall, all were balanced delicately between revelation and restraint. And in that balance, the next movements would be measured, deliberate, and unavoidable. The stage was set, and soon as always, truth would unfold, quietly, inevitably, and with the precision that only observation and patience could bring. The drawing-room of Witchford Hall, illuminated now by the soft glow of a dozen shaded lamps, held a stillness that bordered on reverence. Guests lingered in quiet chairs, speaking in subdued tones, while the servants, unseen yet ever present, moved with the precision of shadows. Alleyn, standing at the periphery, allowed the calm to settle, listening to the faint rustle of gowns, the delicate clink of porcelain, and the hushed cadence of conversation. He did not summon the household to a formal gathering. There was no need for dramatics, no call for confession beneath the glare of scrutiny. Truth, in his experience, revealed itself most effectively when introduced gently, as a quiet inevitability, rather than forced by confrontation. Alleyn approached Lady Honoria, who sat with composure, though the faint crease at the corner of her mouth betrayed subtle tension. He gestured toward Madeline Carswell, who remained seated, hands folded, eyes attentive yet guarded. Alleyn's glance encompassed the room. Every guest, every servant, every figure poised in polite expectancy. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm, courteous, and measured. "The events of these past 24 hours have revealed much. Not in grand gestures, nor in the overt, but in subtle movements, choices, and omissions. It is remarkable how quietly the truth can manifest itself when one knows where to look." A faint murmur passed through the room, not of dissent, but of anticipation. Every listener by now understood that the day's disturbances had not been mere accident. They had been deliberate, purposeful, and quietly destructive. Allen's gaze settled on one figure, the composure of Mr. Geoffrey Patham, ordinarily precise and controlled, now slightly tense. The solicitor's hands, resting lightly upon his knees, betrayed a rigidity that spoke louder than words. "It is within the familiar," Alleyn continued softly, "that we often find the most surprising disruptions. Adrian Lascelles' unfortunate demise did not occur at random. The circumstances, the placement of objects, the subtle alterations of routine, each has indicated the presence of one among us whose knowledge of the household and its rhythms, exceeded ordinary observation. He allowed the words to linger, observing reactions with quiet intent. Some shifted imperceptibly, others maintained outward calm, masking inner apprehension. "Mr. Patham," Alleyn said, inclining his head ever so slightly, "you are well versed in the habits of Witchford Hall. You understand the weight of the fortune, the implications of opportunity, and the subtle pressures that accompany proximity to wealth. You also, regrettably, took advantage of that knowledge to orchestrate a moment that was meant to appear natural, yet left subtle traces detectable to a careful observer." Patham's composure faltered, barely perceptible, but it was enough. He drew in a breath, measured, almost defeated, before meeting Alleyn's calm, unyielding gaze. "You have been careful," Alleyn added, his tone neither accusatory nor harsh. "But one cannot entirely control the unintentional. The tilt of a letter, a delayed gesture, a fleeting glance. And in those moments, the truth quietly asserts itself." Patham inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than resistance. "I see," he murmured, voice low, precise, as though speaking aloud might crystallize the inevitable. "You are correct. I did not intend harm, only advantage. But it seems even careful plans cannot escape the observation of those who know where to look." Alleyn allowed a faint pause, his expression gentle. "Indeed. And in this case, the revelation brings no need for drama nor cruelty beyond what is inevitable. The law will take its course, yet it is worth noting that the quiet detection of truth, measured observation, and restraint often serve justice in their own subtle, indelible way." Lady Honoria, Madeline, and the other guests absorbed the unfolding scene in silence. No shouting, no flourish, merely acknowledgement. The room itself seemed to exhale, as if the revelation had been inevitable all along, and the calm, restrained decorum of Witchford Hall was momentarily restored. Alleyn returned to the periphery, allowing Patham to be escorted quietly, his composure intact, though his eyes reflected the weight of inevitability. Justice, in this instance, was neither theatrical nor loud, but precise, inevitable, and delivered with quiet dignity. And as the household resumed its subdued rhythm, Alleyn observed the lingering traces of tension, the faint tremor of relief, the careful maintenance of composure, and the quiet awareness that beneath civility, human behavior would always reveal itself to the observant eye. The following morning, Witchford Hall maintained the careful cadence of its routines, though the air carried a subtle shift. The weight of inevitability, the quiet acknowledgement that events had altered the household's equilibrium. Alleyn walked the corridors with the ease of familiarity, noting the subdued movements of servants and the cautious civility of the guests. Nothing was chaotic, nothing was theatrical. Yet beneath the stillness, consequences had begun to take shape. Patham's removal from the house the previous evening had been discreet, handled with precision by the local constabulary, summoned quietly by Alleyn himself. There was no scandal, no abrupt disruption of social grace. The solicitor's departure, like his crime, had been executed with careful composure, leaving the household to absorb the reality in silence. Alleyn paused in the drawing-room, surveying the faces around him. Lady Honoria sat with a book, though her eyes flicked frequently to the hallway as though measuring the pace of returning normality. Madeline Carswell, composed yet alert, followed the subtle movements of the staff, noting each footfall, each adjustment of a chair or curtain. Even in the quiet, the psychology of the household had shifted. Vigilance now coexisted with relief, awareness tempered by propriety. He approached Lady Honoria. "The household seems calm, yet I detect the subtle residue of tension," he said, his voice soft, cultured. "Do you find this accurate?" Honoria inclined her head with faint acknowledgement. "It is. Calm but aware. Even in routine, one senses the undercurrent of memory, Roderick. The knowledge of what has occurred lingers like a shadow that does not fade entirely. Indeed, Alleyn replied, and that shadow is sometimes more instructive than the noise of action. There is a kind of justice that requires no dramatic display. Inevitability, recognition, and the quiet adjustment of consequence. Alleyn allowed himself a measured pause, observing the household's subtle choreography. Servants adjusting curtains, dusting tables with deliberate care, the careful replacement of misplaced objects. All of it spoke to order reasserting itself, yet with the faintest acknowledgement of fracture. Patham's removal, Alleyn continued, is not theatrical. There is no need for confrontation or recrimination beyond what is unavoidable. The law will follow its course. Yet in this instance, justice is coupled with a certain irony. The very traits that enabled his subtle orchestration, knowledge of routine, attention to detail, and skill in observation, were ultimately his undoing. Even the most measured individual cannot escape the scrutiny of one who observes more quietly. Honoria's lips pressed together, a ghost of a smile. Irony, she murmured, is often the only companion of wealth, ambition, and misjudgment. Alleyn allowed the words to linger. He appreciated the quiet reflection, the acknowledgement that human behavior, meticulously observed, revealed patterns invisible to those who acted without thought or restraint. In that quiet, irony often asserted itself more surely than punishment. The household, freed from immediate tension, moved with a restrained grace. Guests resumed their positions, engaging in muted conversation, maintaining the elaborate balance of civility and discretion. The servants continued their duties, their eyes bright with comprehension, yet respectful silence. Alleyn understood, as he always did, that those who observed most closely often held the key to continuity, the bridge between disorder and restored equilibrium. He reflected, too, on Adrian's absence, the fortune now secure from further subtle manipulation, and the impact upon the family. The inheritance, once a catalyst of tension and ambition, now existed as a quiet force, an unspoken reminder of human fallibility and the delicate choreography of privilege, expectation, and moral lapse. Alleyn lingered in the drawing room a final moment, allowing the nuances of the morning to imprint themselves. Justice had been served not with dramatics, but with inevitability. Irony had settled, subtle yet firm, upon the household. No one shouted, no one collapsed in despair. Yet all understood without words the delicate balance between consequence and restraint, observation and intention. And as the morning light shifted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across polished floors, Alleyn recognized the quiet truth that had always guided him. Human nature, however carefully veiled, reveals itself in due course, through gesture, omission, and the inexorable weight of circumstance. By late afternoon, Witchford Hall had resumed the quiet rhythms that defined its daily life. The corridors, once charged with tension, now carried only the soft echoes of measured footsteps. The servants moved with the same precision as always, the guests lingered in subdued conversation, and the grand house itself seemed to exhale, as though relieved that the delicate balance had been restored. Alleyn, standing near the tall windows of the library, observed the interplay of light and shadow, the warm glow of polished wood, and the subtle vibrations of human behavior. It was in moments such as this, after careful deduction, quiet confrontation, and the inevitability of revelation, that the truth of a house, its inhabitants, and the fragile social constructs they inhabited, became apparent. He allowed his gaze to rest briefly on Lady Honoria, seated with her book now closed, her posture impeccably composed, yet relaxed. Madeline Carswell moved softly across the room, adjusting a cushion and folding a throw with the careful precision that betrayed a mind attuned to order. The household was restored, yet Alleyn sensed the lingering imprint of the past day's events, a subtle mark on the psyche of all who resided within. Justice, he reflected, had been served with quiet dignity. Patham had departed under controlled circumstances, the law's machinery set in motion without the need for spectacle. Yet it was not only law that had guided the resolution. It was the gentle accumulation of observation, intuition, and the patient unweaving of social facades. No raised voices, no melodrama, merely recognition, inevitability, and the soft pressure of consequence. Alleyn's thoughts turned to the intricacies of human behavior that had emerged over the course of his investigation. The delicate fractures in politeness, the subtle hesitations in speech, the unintentional gestures that spoke volumes. Each had contributed to the revelation, forming a tapestry of human nature rendered visible to the attentive eye. He considered the heir himself, Adrian Lascelles, whose absence now defined the quiet of the hall. The young man's death had been sudden, yet its circumstances had been quietly orchestrated, a reminder of how easily ambition, opportunity, and vulnerability could intersect. The fortune he had inherited remained, untouched by Patham's ambitions, yet its presence was a silent testament to human desire, restraint, and the moral calculus of those who would navigate proximity to wealth. Alleyn turned his attention to the servants, whose silent vigilance had been indispensable. Reynolds and Mrs. Hargreaves, along with the others, had maintained the invisible lattice of knowledge that only those who dwell in observation can possess. They had not interfered. Yet their awareness had shaped the unfolding of events, their discretion ensuring that revelation could occur precisely as it ought, quietly, subtly, and without unnecessary disturbance. He allowed a small smile to touch his lips, a private acknowledgement of the art inherent in human behavior. The quiet observation of life, the recognition of character, and the patient assembly of seemingly trivial details were often more potent than any overt act of detection. And in this understanding lay the satisfaction of justice tempered with elegance. Alleyn walked slowly to the drawing-room, pausing to observe the last guests taking their leave. Civility remained intact, grace unbroken, and yet he sensed a subtle shift, a layer of awareness beneath the surface. Those present would carry the memory of this day, the quiet revelation, and the demonstration that even in the most measured households, human nature cannot remain entirely concealed. He lingered for a moment by the fireplace, watching the flicker of lamplight across the polished floor. There was a poetry in the stillness, a quiet eloquence in the way human intention and consequence interwove. In Witchford Hall, civility and decorum had prevailed, yet beneath them lay the inexorable weight of human psychology, the true instrument of revelation. Alleyn allowed a deep breath to settle the day's work within him. The mystery had been resolved, the subtle currents unraveled, and the balance restored. And yet he knew, as he always did, that human behavior, desire, and discretion were eternal, recurring in variations as intricate as they were inevitable. He turned toward the windows, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the polished floors. In that quiet reflection, he recognized what he had always known, that the truth of a household, a fortune, or a human soul is rarely loud, rarely dramatic. It is revealed in the smallest gestures, the measured silences, and the subtle interplay of observation and intention. And with that recognition, Alleyn allowed himself a moment of calm. Witchford Hall, with its elegance, its shadows, and its secrets, remained poised between the known and the unknowable, a world both orderly and fragile. He knew the balance would endure, as it always had, as it always must, until the quiet hand of observation once again discerned the truths hidden in plain sight.